This story is more than just words. It's a testimony of what happens when grace meets brokenness. Stick around and be sure to like and subscribe if it resonates with your spirit. Seeds from the Desert. Chapter 1. The Fall. The scorching sun beat down on James Forrester's face as he trudged along the dusty highway that cut through the heart of rural Arizona. His once immaculate Brooks Brothers suit was now wrinkled and stained, his leather shoes scuffed beyond recognition. The only possession that still hinted at his former life was the titanium watch on his wrist, a gift from the board of directors when his company had gone public 3 years ago. He hadn't bothered to sell it. The memory it carried was worth more to him than the few $100s it might fetch. 6 months ago, James had been the CEO of Agritech Solutions, a promising startup in San Francisco that had developed an innovative irrigation system for large-scale farming operations. Investors had poured millions into his vision. Business magazines had featured his face, calling him the future of American agriculture. He had believed his own press, expanding too quickly, making promises his technology couldn't yet fulfill. When the system failed catastrophically during a demonstration for their largest potential client flooding, thousands of acres of valuable cropland the House of Cards had collapsed. Lawsuits followed. Investors pulled out. The board forced him to resign. His wife of 8 years decided she couldn't weather this particular storm and filed for divorce, taking their home in the process. Now, at 42, James Forrester had nothing but the clothes on his back and the crushing weight of failure on his shoulders. He paused on the highway's shoulder, using a handkerchief to wipe the sweat from his brow. In the distance, he could make out the faint outline of a small tona cluster of buildings shimmering in the heat. According to the faded road sign he'd passed a mile back, it was called Redemption. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Appropriate," he muttered to himself, adjusting the small backpack that contained his meager belongings. He had been wandering for weeks now, taking odd jobs when he could find them, sleeping in cheap motels or, when necessary, under the stars. There was no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to keep moving, as if physical distance could somehow separate him from his failures. As the sun began to set, painting the desert landscape in hues of orange and purple, James quickened his pace. Whatever this tiny town held, it had to be better than another night exposed to the elements. Chapter 2. Redemption. Redemption, Arizona, population 847, according to the welcome sign, was little more than a main street with a handful of businesses, a general store, a diner called Maggie's, a small post office, and a gas station. The buildings were weathered by decades of sun and sand, but there was something resilient about the placé, quiet dignity that James hadn't expected. The bell above the door of Maggie's diner jingled as he entered. A few heads turned to look at the stranger, then politely returned to their conversations. The diner was cozy, with red vinyl booths and the smell of coffee and freshly baked pie in the air. "Take a seat wherever you like, hon," called a woman from behind the counter. She was in her 60s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back into a practical bun, crow's feet around kind eyes. James slid into a booth near the window and examined the laminated menu. His funds were dwindling. He would need to find work soon. "Just coffee, please," he said when the woman Maggie herself, he presumed, approached with a pot. She poured the steaming liquid into a white ceramic mug. "New in town?" "Just passing through," James replied, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. Maggie studied him for a moment. "You look like you could use a meal. Special today is meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans." Before James could decline, she continued, "First meals on the house for travelers, town tradition." The kindness in her voice, so unexpected, so undeserved, made something catch in James's throat. "Thank you," he managed. As he ate the first home-cooked meal he'd had in weeks, James observed the other patrons. They weren't wealthy people, farmers, shopkeepers, mechanics, judging by their clothes and conversations, but there was a contentment here that seemed foreign to him now. "You know, if you're looking for work," Maggie said as she refilled his coffee cup, "Old man Peterson at the hardware store was saying he needed some help unloading shipments. His back isn't what it used to be." James nodded gratefully. "I'll check it out. Thank you. And if you need a place to stay, Sarah Jenkins rents rooms above the bookstore. Nothing fancy, but clean and affordable." By the time James left the diner, twilight had fallen over Redemption. The desert stars were emerging, brighter than he'd ever seen them in the city. For the first time in months, he felt a faint spark of something that might be hope. Chapter 3. The Old Church. 3 weeks passed quickly. James worked at Peterson's Hardware during the day, unloading trucks, organizing inventory, and helping customers. The physical labor was a welcome change from boardroom battles and spreadsheets. His body grew stronger, tanned by the Arizona sun, his mind clearer with each passing day. Yet the emptiness remained a void that neither work nor his modest room above the bookstore could fill. He was existing, not living. The weight of his past failures still pressed down on him, particularly in the quiet evenings when he had nothing but his thoughts for company. On a Sunday morning in late September, James was walking down Main Street when the sound of singing drew his attention. It came from an old white church at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with a small steeple that he had passed many times but never entered. Something compelled him to approach. The wooden doors stood open, welcoming anyone who wished to enter. James hesitated at the threshold, feeling like an imposter. It had been years since he'd set foot in any church. His ambitious pursuit of success had left little time for spiritual matters. "Come on in," a deep voice invited. An older man with weathered skin and silver hair stood beside him, smiling warmly. "I'm Pastor Mike. Don't believe I've seen you here before." "James Forrester," he replied, shaking the offered hand. "I'm just visiting town." "Well, James, everyone's welcome here." The pastor gestured toward the pews. "Nothing fancy, just neighbors gathering to support each other and find a little wisdom for the journey." Something in the man's unpretentious manner put James at ease. He found himself following Pastor Mike into the church, taking a seat in the back pew. The congregation was small, perhaps 30 poplamics of ages and backgrounds. They sang without a choir or sophisticated instruments, just simple hymns accompanied by an old piano. When it came time for the sermon, Pastor Mike didn't speak from behind an ornate pulpit but sat on a stool in front of his congregation, Bible open on his lap. "Today," he began, "I want to talk about seeds, specifically the mustard seed." He held up something so tiny that James could barely see it from where he sat. In Matthew 17:20, Jesus tells us, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." James listened initially with skepticism, then with growing interest as Pastor Mike spoke about how the smallest beginnings could lead to unexpected growth, how faith wasn't about quantity but quality, how sometimes, when we think we've lost everything, we're actually being prepared for a new kind of harvest. "The desert," Pastor Mike said, looking around at his congregation, "seems like the last place you'd expect to find life. But those of us who live here know better. The desert blooms in its own time, in its own way, and often the harshest conditions produce the most resilient life." For reasons James couldn't fully articulate, tears welled in his eyes. He blinked them back, grateful for the anonymity of the back pew. After the service, as people gathered for coffee and homemade cookies, James found himself drawn into conversation with the pastor and several congregation members. They didn't ask about his past or his profession. They spoke instead about the recent rainfall, the community garden behind the church, and an upcoming harvest festival. "You should stop by the garden sometime," Pastor Mike suggested as James was preparing to leave. "We started it 10 years ago on a patch of land everyone said was too alkaline to grow anything. Now we grow enough vegetables to help supplement the local food pantry. Nothing gives perspective like putting your hands in the soil and watching what emerges." James nodded, making a non-committal promise to visit, but as he walked back to his rented room, the image of the mustard seed stayed with him, a tiny speck containing enormous potential. A beginning so small, it seemed insignificant. That night, he dreamed of seeds sprouting in desert sand. Chapter 4. The Garden. 2 days later, James found himself standing at the gate of the community garden behind the church. It was larger than he had imagined, nearly an acre of carefully tended plots bordered by fruit trees and native desert plants. A greenhouse stood at one end, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. "Thought you might show up," said a voice behind him. Pastor Mike approached, carrying a watering can and wearing gardening gloves. "Come on in." James followed him through the gate. "This is impressive." We started small, the pastor replied, moving between rows of tomato plants heavy with fruit. Just a few raised beds and a lot of prayer. The soil here isn't naturally hospitable, as you can imagine. How did you make it work? Pastor Mike gestured for James to follow him to a large compost bin at the corner of the garden. We learned to work with what we had, not against it. Added organic matter, collected rainwater, chose plants that could handle the conditions. But most importantly, he scooped up a handful of dark, rich soil. We believed it could be done when everyone else said it was impossible. As they walked through the garden, the pastor introduced James to other volunteers: a retired school teacher tending to herbs, a young mother and her children harvesting carrots, an elderly couple pruning fruit trees. They worked together with a sense of purpose and community that stirred something in James. "Would you like to help?" Pastor Mike asked, offering him a pair of gardening gloves. "We're planting fall crops today." Almost to his own surprise, James accepted. He spent the afternoon on his knees in the soil, learning to prepare seed beds, to plant according to the proper depth and spacing, to water gently so as not to disturb the newly planted seeds. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the voice of self-recrimination in his head was silent. There was only the task at hand, the feel of earth between his fingers, the scent of soil and growing things. "You know," said Pastor Mike as they cleaned tools at day's end, "we've been thinking about expanding the garden. There's that empty field next to Johnson's property, used to be a failed development before the housing crash. Soil's poor, but with the right approach." James found himself nodding, his mind already calculating possibilities. "You'd need to test the soil composition first. Depending on the results, you might be able to remediate it naturally over time." The pastor looked at him with interest. "Sounds like you know something about growing things." James hesitated, then said simply, "I used to be in agricultural technology." "Is that so?" Pastor Mike smiled. "Well, we could use that kind of knowledge around here. Most of us are enthusiastic amateurs at best." As James walked back to town in the gathering dusk, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. The seed of an idea was beginning to germinate in his mind. Chapter 5. The Proposal. Over the next few weeks, James became a regular at the community garden. Between shifts at the hardware store, he threw himself into learning everything he could about desert agriculture, borrowing books from the town's tiny library, researching online at the community center's computers, and most importantly, listening to the local farmers who had generations of knowledge about the particular challenges of growing food in this harsh environment. He discovered that Redemption had once been an agricultural community, with small family farms surrounding the town. But years of drought, combined with economic pressures and aging farmers with no one to take over their land, had led to many farms being abandoned or sold to developers who had their own plans fail in the 2008 recession. One evening, after helping harvest the last of the summer vegetables, James approached Pastor Mike with a folder of notes and sketches. "I've been thinking about what you said about expanding the garden," he began. "I believe there's potential for something bigger." Pastor Mike listened intently as James outlined his vision: a sustainable agricultural project that would reclaim abandoned farmland around Redemption. Using water conservation techniques, soil remediation, and appropriate crop selection, they could create a model of desert agriculture that would provide both food and livelihoods for the community. "The beauty of it," James explained, his eyes alight with an enthusiasm he'd thought lost forever, "is that it doesn't require massive capital investment. We start small, prove the concept on one plot, then expand as we show results. The methods I'm proposing use principles of permaculture and regenerative agriculture, working with the natural systems instead of fighting against them." Pastor Mike studied the diagrams James had drawn. "This is impressive, James. But where would we get the land to start?" "Actually," James said, "I've already spoken to Mrs. Johnson about the field you mentioned. She's willing to let us use 5 acres as a test plot if we can pay the property taxes, which are minimal since it's classified as unimproved land." The pastor looked at him thoughtfully. "You've put a lot of work into this." James nodded. "I needed something to rebuild with." "And you believe this could really help Redemption?" "I do." James leaned forward. "This town took me in when I had nothing. The people here showed me kindness without asking for anything in return. I want to give something back. And I really believe that this could transform not just the land, but the community." Pastor Mike was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. "Well, if we're going to do this, we should present it to the town council. They meet next Tuesday evening." The following week, James stood before the town council in the small meeting room at the back of the town hall. His palms were sweaty, reminiscent of his first investor pitch years ago, but this time the stakes felt higher. He wasn't seeking personal gain or acclaim, but a chance to help a community that had begun to heal something broken inside him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "my name is James Forrester. I came to your town as a stranger with nothing to offer. You've given me work, shelter, and community. Now I'd like to propose a project that could help revitalize Redemption's agricultural heritage." As he spoke, describing the vision for what he was calling Desert Bloom Cooperative, James saw skepticism on some faces, curiosity on others. He outlined the technical aspects: water catchment systems, drip irrigation, companion planting, soil amendments, but emphasized the human element, jobs for local residents, training opportunities for young people, fresh produce for the community, and eventually specialty crops that could be sold to restaurants and markets in Phoenix. When he finished, there was silence, then a flood of questions. How much would it cost? How long before they saw results? Who would do the work? What if it failed? James answered as honestly as he could, acknowledging the risks, but emphasizing the potential rewards. "The initial investment is minimal," he explained. "We're talking about reclaiming land that's currently generating no value. The biggest investment will be labor, and I'm proposing we start with volunteers, including myself, and grow from there." Mayor Eleanor Wilson, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who owned the local feed store, studied him. "Mr. Forrester, you clearly know a lot about agriculture. Why Redemption? Why not take this idea somewhere with more resources, better conditions?" James took a deep breath. "Because Redemption gave me something when I had nothing, and because I believe in the principle of the mustard seed. Sometimes the most unlikely place is exactly where something needs to grow." Chapter 6. Seeds of Change. The town council voted to support the Desert Bloom Cooperative, providing access to a municipal well and waiving permit fees for the first year. News spread quickly through Redemption, and on the Saturday designated for the project's launch, James was astonished to find over 30 volunteers gathered at the Johnson Field, nearly a tenth of the town's adult population. They came with tools, pickup trucks loaded with compost, salvaged lumber, and determination. Pastor Mike opened the day with a brief prayer, and then they got to work. The transformation began with simple steps. They divided the 5 acres into sections, marked out pathways, and started building raised beds in the areas where soil tests had shown the worst conditions. James worked alongside everyone else, demonstrating techniques, answering questions, getting to know his neighbors in a deeper way through shared labor. Tom Miller, a retired engineer, helped design a rainwater harvesting system that would capture the infrequent but often intense desert rainfall. Sarah Jenkins from the bookstore organized a seed library, collecting heirloom varieties adapted to arid conditions. High school students came after classes to help with the physical labor, earning community service credits and learning practical skills. There were challenges, of course. An unexpected early frost killed some of their first plantings. Funding was perpetually tight, requiring creative solutions and repurposing of materials. Some community members remained skeptical, watching from a distance rather than participating. But as autumn turned to winter, and winter to spring, the first real results began to show. Green shoots emerged from the carefully tended soil. The rainwater system proved its worth during a February downpour. A greenhouse constructed from reclaimed windows and lumber allowed them to start seedlings early. By late spring, the first harvest was ready radishes, lettuce, spinach, and early peas. They held a community dinner in the field, tables set up between the growing plants, everyone bringing dishes to share alongside the vegetables they had grown together. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit, James looked around at the faces of people who had been strangers less than a year ago and felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Mayor Wilson approached him as he stood at the edge of the gathering. "You know," she said, When you first presented this idea, I thought you were either a fool or a con man. James smiled. A reasonable assumption. But you've proven me wrong, she continued, and I'm not too proud to admit it. This project is bringing something back to redemption that we lost. Not just the farming, but the sense that we can build something meaningful together. It's still early days, James cautioned. One good season doesn't prove sustainability. True enough. But I've been talking to the council about the Mercer property 200 acres that the county seized for back taxes years ago. It's just sitting there. If your methods work on a larger scale, James felt his heart rate quicken. That would be a significant expansion. The mayor nodded. Think about it. Draw up a proposal. There are state grants for rural development we could apply for. As she walked away, James looked out over the field glowing in the last light of day. Where once there had been barren ground, now there was abundance. Not an overnight miracle, but the result of faith, knowledge, hard work, and community all growing together. Chapter 7. Bloom. 3 years later, James stood on a small rise overlooking what had become the Desert Bloom Agricultural Center. What had started with 5 acres had expanded to over 250. The original Johnson Field was now an intensive demonstration garden where visitors and students could learn techniques for home-scale desert gardening. The Mercer property had been developed into a working farm with sections for vegetable production, fruit orchards adapted to desert conditions, experimental plots for drought-resistant grain varieties, and native pollinator habitats. Solar panels powered efficient drip irrigation systems. Composting facilities turned the town's organic waste into rich soil amendments. A small processing facility allowed them to preserve and add value to their harvests, producing dried herbs, fruit preserves, and specialty items that were now being sold in stores throughout Arizona and online. A weekly farmers market in Redemption drew visitors from surrounding communities. Most importantly, Desert Bloom now employed 27 people full-time with additional seasonal positions during harvest times. The project had spawned related businesses: a farm-to-table cafe opened by Maggie's daughter, a landscaping company specializing in edible desert gardens, and a small seed company focused on arid-adapted varieties. James had declined the title of CEO that the board of the now incorporated nonprofit had offered him, preferring project coordinator instead. His past experience with the trappings of corporate power had taught him valuable lessons about humility and shared leadership. This particular morning, he was preparing to welcome a group of visitor agricultural officials from several drought-affected counties who wanted to learn about Desert Bloom's methods. As he waited, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had come to Redemption broken and empty-handed, carrying nothing but failure and regret. Now he stood amid abundance that had sprung from that very emptiness, like a seed that must be stripped of everything before it can germinate and grow. "Penny for your thoughts," said a familiar voice. Pastor Mike, now in his 70s but still spry, climbed the rise to stand beside him. James smiled, just thinking about mustard seeds. The older man nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. They've grown into quite a shade tree, haven't they? Below them, the first visitors' cars were pulling into the parking area. Soon, James would be leading them on a tour, explaining techniques and systems, sharing knowledge freely in the hope that what had happened in Redemption could be replicated elsewhere. "You know," Pastor Mike said, "when you first came to town, I saw a man who thought he had lost everything. But sometimes we have to lose what we thought was important to find what truly is." James nodded. "I built my first company thinking success was about profit margins and market share. I measured everything in dollars and cents. And now?" He gestured toward the fields where people were already at work, harvesting, planting, building. "Now I measure success differently, by the health of the soil, by the number of people who have meaningful work, by the children who know where their food comes from and how to grow it themselves." In the distance, he could see Sarah Jenkins now, his wife of 8 months, leading a group of school children through the educational garden. His life had been replanted here, roots growing deeper than he'd ever allowed them to grow before. "I should go greet our visitors," James said. Pastor Mike put a hand on his shoulder. "Before you go, I've been meaning to ask, what happened to that fancy watch you used to wear when you first came to town?" James smiled. I sold it last year. Used the money to fund scholarships for 3 high school students to attend the Sustainable Agriculture program at the community college. The pastor nodded approvingly. A good trade. The best I've ever made, James agreed, then headed down the hill to welcome the visitors, ready to share the harvest that had grown from seeds planted in the desert of his greatest failure. Epilogue: The Harvest Festival. The October evening was perfect for Redemption's annual Harvest Festival, cool enough for light jackets, but warm enough to enjoy being outdoors as the sun set over the desert horizon. Main Street had been transformed with strings of lights, booths displaying local crafts and produce, and long tables set up for the community feast. James moved through the crowd, greeting friends and neighbors, occasionally stopping to answer questions from visitors about Desert Bloom. The project had gained national attention now, featured in agricultural journals and sustainability magazines. Delegations came regularly from other communities facing similar challenges, looking to adapt Redemption's model to their own situations. As he approached the central square, James saw his wife Sarah organizing a children's activity planting seeds in small biodegradable pots they could take home. She looked up and caught his eye, her smile still causing his heart to skip after all this time. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Wilson's voice came over the sound system. If I could have your attention for a moment. The crowd quieted as she continued. 5 years ago, our town was struggling. Young people were leaving for opportunities elsewhere. Businesses were closing. Our agricultural heritage seemed like a thing of the past. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the older residents who remembered those times. And then, the mayor said, a stranger arrived in our town with nothing but the clothes on his back and an idea that many of us thought was, frankly, a bit crazy. This drew chuckles from the crowd. But that idea that we could revitalize our community by working with our challenging environment instead of against ITHA's transformed Redemption. She gestured toward the booths displaying Desert Bloom products, the tables laden with food grown in their fields, the faces of people who now had sustainable livelihoods. Tonight, as we celebrate another successful harvest, the Town Council has an announcement to make. Thanks to the success of Desert Bloom and related initiatives, Redemption's population has grown for the first time in 20 years. Our school enrollment is up. New businesses have opened. And today, we received official confirmation that our application for the Rural Innovation Grant has been approved, which means funding for our new Agricultural Education Center. Cheers erupted. The Education Center had been a dream for years, a place where Desert Bloom's techniques could be taught formally, where research could be conducted, where the next generation could learn to be stewards of the land. None of this would have been possible, Mayor Wilson continued when the applause died down, without one man's vision and perseverance, someone who saw potential where others saw only wasteland. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking James Forrester. James felt his face flush as all eyes turned to him and applause swelled again. Pastor Mike gave him a gentle push toward the small stage where the mayor stood. As he made his way there, James thought about how different this applause felt from the accolades he had received in his previous life. This wasn't about him or his ego. It was recognition of what a community could accomplish together when united by a common purpose. Standing beside Mayor Wilson, looking out at the faces of people who had become like family, James raised his hands for quiet. Thank you, he said simply. But this isn't about me. This is about all of us, working together, about believing that something beautiful can grow in the most unlikely places. He paused, emotion making his voice rough. I came to Redemption at the lowest point in my life. I had lost everything I thought mattered: wealth, status, professional reputation. What I didn't realize then was that I needed to lose those things to find what truly matters. James sought out Pastor Mike in the crowd. Someone wise once shared with me the parable of the mustard seed, how the smallest beginning can lead to unexpected growth. Each of you planted seeds of kindness when you welcomed a stranger into your community. You offered work when I needed purpose, friendship when I needed connection, and eventually, trust when I proposed a vision that must have seemed impossible. He gestured to the bounty around them. Look what has grown from those seeds, not because of any special talent of mine, but because of the faith and hard work of an entire community. The real miracle of desert bloom isn't the agricultural techniques or the economic impact, it's the reminder that renewal is always possible, that life can flourish even in the harshest conditions when we nurture it together. As the celebration continued into the evening with music and dancing, shared food and laughter, James found a quiet moment with Pastor Mike at the edge of the gathering. "Did you ever imagine," the older man asked, "when you were walking into town that first day, that things would turn out this way?" James shook his head. "I had no vision then, no hope. I was just putting one foot in front of the other." "Sometimes that's all we can do," Pastor Mike mused. "Take the next step, plant the next seed, and trust that something good can grow." They stood in companionable silence, watching the community's celebration, the product of seeds planted in desert soil, nurtured by faith, knowledge, and collective effort. The harvest was plentiful, and not just in crops. It could be seen in the renewed vitality of the town, in the relationships formed, in the hope restored. For James Forrester, once a broken man wandering without purpose, it was the most beautiful sight imaginable, a garden blooming in what had once been his personal desert, proof that no failure is final as long as there are seeds of faith to plant anew.